Thank you very much for having me here in Notre Dame. I don't remember when was the last time I was here. I'm going to discuss something not very original, admittedly, which is the relation between sociological criticism and formal criticism, or form and content, or subject and object, however you want to call it. Not a new topic for conversation, but a topic that every now and then returns to haunt literary studies and literary theory in general. For instance, with this first book by Alberto Casadei. This is, by the way, one of the presentations that I always tell my students never to use, with words, only words, very few images, no clips. But I thought, since I want to discuss some excerpts, it would be good. The book by Casadei, which is a book that annoyed me for many reasons. One, because it seems to deploy a little bit too cavalierly what Antonio Gramsci would have called Americanism. It's a defense of the citadel of Italian literary studies, apparently besieged by an American invasion. Namely cultural studies, a spurious method, says Casadei, an Americanata, as it were, for which, and this is the first quotation on your screen, literariness as such no longer has an autonomous specific weight, and this literature is inspected instead more for its sociological contributions expressed through themes than for its aesthetic formal aspects. Casadei may have a point, and in fact, as Gianni Turchetta reminds us with the second quote on the screen, sociological criticism has been under attack in Italy for a while, even before sociological criticism was so cavalierly associated with the Americanata of cultural studies. For the last 20 years, writes Turchetta, sociological criticism is no longer in fashion. While, he adds, for a long time, let's not forget, it had been exceedingly fashionable. But why this change of fortune for sociological criticism? For not entirely good reasons, I suspect. And Turchetta tells us as much. Basically, when the generation of Franco Fortini, Carlo Muscetta, and Maria Corti died or retired, Italy entered, around the same years, around the year 1977, the period of so-called riflusso. The emancipatory movements of 1968 and 1977 were reabsorbed into Craxismo and Berlusconismo in Italy, and at a more international level, Reaganism and Thatcherism. What does have that to do with literature? Well, because literature, which since the war, perhaps actually since Dante, in Italy had always had a civic mission, had always participated in the social and civic duty of creating the cultural conditions for social emancipation, was reduced after 1977 to a mere technique, a postmodern game, deprived by the alleged death of grand narratives of any social value and implication. If so, Turchetta's problematic, which I would like to make my own for today, is not, or ought not to be, to refuse sociological criticism altogether, but rather to reconcile the technicalities of formal analysis with the concept of the social relevance of literature, which we may not want, whether an Americanat or not, to sacrifice too quickly at the well-wrought earn of literariness. Well, in Italy, this controversy over literariness and sociology had an important precedent in the debate over the relevance of Antonio Gramsci for literary theory. To recap very briefly, Palmiro Togliatti's attempt to glean a theory of literature out of the prison notebooks began in 1947 with the publication of the thematic volume on literature and national life, and culminating in 1958 with the works of Carlo Muscetta and Giuseppe Petronio, came to an abrupt halt in 1959, when Gianni Scalia proposed that Gramsci was fundamentally useless for any theory of literature, as Gramsci was concerned with, in Scalia's words, the problem of what we may call a sociology of literature. Still in the 1960s, even the most sociological of Italian literary critics was quick to dismiss Gramsci, not only for his lowbrow interest in the national popular feuilleton, but because his notes, citation number 1, are more about the pedagogical political sphere than the properly artistic one. To sum up with Bartolo Anglani's Fatal Sentenza, which is in the second citation, Gramsci's thesis on literature, although interesting, move in a perspective that is not that of aesthetics or literary criticism, but in a perspective of a sociology of culture. As far as literature is concerned, concluded Anglani, I believe that criticism can leave Gramsci behind. In short, two distinct problematics, that of literary theory between formalism and sociology, and that of Gramsci's usefulness for literary theory, are intertwined. It is then to these two related problematics that I would like to devote my presentation, but not before reminding us that precisely here at the University of Notre Dame, such problematics have become the focus of a series of seminal essays by Joseph Buttigieg on the exemplarity of Gramsci, his work, of Gramsci for literary criticism. It was precisely a distinction between formal criticism on the one hand and sociological criticism on the other, Buttigieg wrote, that Gramsci tried very hard to overcome. Here is my problem. Since I tried to trace Gramsci's overcoming of such distinction in an essay that should appear soon in the journal Italian Culture, soon, right? Soon. I'd rather not repeat myself, and I will make only a rough summary of my argument by focusing on two notes from Gramsci's notebooks, and for the following part of my presentation, I will look instead at a few canonical examples from Italian literature to test the relevance of Gramsci's intuition as a way to conduct a literary analysis that is formal and sociological at the same time. The first Gramscian passage I would like to bring to your attention is taken from Notebook 8, titled Notes on Philosophy. Content, writes Gramsci, does not just mean the choice of a particular milieu or environment. What is essential to the content is the attitude that the author and this generation bring to the milieu. Even in Manzoni and in Verga, the determining factor is their attitude toward their popular characters, not the characters themselves, and their attitudes are antithetical. Manzoni's is an attitude of Catholic paternalism. This is probably, I could have omitted at Notre Dame, but too late. His implicit irony is indicative of the absence of deep instinctive love for those characters. Manzoni's attitude, notice the continuous repetition of this word, is dictated by an extraneous feeling of abstract duty decreed by Catholic morality, but corrected and then living by pervasive irony. Verga's is an attitude of cold, scientific, and photographic impassivity. Let us begin by stating the implicit sociological concern behind these words. Manzoni and Verga are, so to speak, the before and after of the Italian Risorgimento, that historical event that Gramsci saw as a translation, or better, a mistranslation, of the logic of the French Revolution into the historical reality of Italy. At the core of this logic was what Gramsci called the participation of the popular masses to the political life of the state. In other words, with the revolution, the very notion of state sovereignty had been utterly revolutionized. No longer the prerogative of the king, authority was now in the hands of a sovereign people. But since popular authority could not be expressed in complex mass societies through direct participation of each single individual, authority needed to rely now on what Gramsci called representative system, sistema rappresentativo. System because while the party represents the people by stepping in the people's shoes, representation as vertretung, the party remains in turn a proxy of the people itself, darstellum. If representation and popular representation more specifically was a key problematic of the new nation, its own literature could not but reflect it. See, I even put the word in. Unsurprisingly, the manifesto of Italian Romanticism that was Giovanni Berchet's Lettera Semiseria, 1816, kept insisting on the necessity to create a new and modern literature capable of representing its people. Il popolo non obliato, non vilipeso dai suoi poeti, ma carezzato, ma dilettato, ma istruito. And Manzoni's betrothed had duly provided representation to the popolo in the figures of Renzo and Lucia, to which Vergas Malavollas would later provide a more tragic example. So where is the problem that Gramsci sees in Manzoni and Verga? Had not they given either to denied representation to a popolo downtrodden by Don Rodrigos and by fate? Well, the problem for Gramsci is not in the sociological content of what is represented, but precisely in how such sociological representation takes shape. What concerns him, in his own words, is the attitude that gives form and structure to that representation. An attitude that is not merely that of the author, but rather, qualifies Gramsci, that of an entire generation. A dominant ideology, in short, given that, to paraphrase from the German ideology, the ruling attitudes of an epoch are in essence the attitudes of the epoch's ruling generation. What Gramsci means by attitude is clarified after a drink by the second passage that I want to bring to your attention, note 24 from notebook 1. It follows a previous note on Goffredo Bellonci's review on Margherita Sarfatti's novel Il Palazzone. Gramsci had absolutely no respect for Bellonci. He called him in another note macchietta della critica letteraria, a caricature of literary criticism. He starts paying attention to this review of Sarfatti's Il Palazzone, a novel that, as all readers point out, paints the portrait of the perfect fascist lady submissive to the will of what Vittoria de Grazia has called il fascino del Priapo. Gramsci is amused by the novel, and especially by the manner in which Sarfatti describes the scene of the sexual encounter between husband and wife. In Bellonci's praise of that scene, with virgin bashfulness, she stands in front of the matrimonial bed while sensing that, and Bellonci now quotes from Sarfatti, it is benign, the bed, and welcoming for the coming jousts. Amusing for Gramsci is particularly the deployment of the topos of the giostra, the joust, a topos that, from Boccaccio's Teseida to Poliziano's Stanze, had established a metaphorical parallelism between erotic love and the duel, l'amore e l'arme. A topos, moreover, on which licentious literature had built its fortune, playing in Poggio, Masuccio Salernitano, Bandello, and Up to Marino, on the double entendre of phallic spears, swords that penetrate the flesh, and tongues entwined in frenetic duels. Note 24 establishes then a comparison between Sarfatti's description of the sexual act, and here I'm going to get in trouble in Notre Dame, chapter 21, Dante and the Whore, from La Leggenda di Dante, an anthology of popular tales on Dante published in 1911 by Rocco Carabba, with an introduction by Giovanni Papini. The legend was centered on the popular invention of a Dante who responds to provocations regarding his sexual prowess in crude and direct popular language. A language that, in a following note, Gramsci describes with Dante's own words as parlar aspro come pietra. In the previous note on Sarfatti, Gramsci had in fact imagined a rewriting of the same scene of the sexual encounter in the harsh language of Dante. No doubt, a different scene would have opened. Rather than virgin's bashfulness, the scene would have been one, in Buttigieg's translation, of many a long romp and a good mount. Why then, in speaking of sex, does the narrator of Palazzone chooses the allusive style of the unsaid, of the allusion? For a simple reason, says Gramsci. Because only a man, but not a woman, can talk of jousting. Remember Chesterton's expression on the key and the lock, referring to the battle of the sexes, which shows that the point of view of the key cannot be that of the lock. In other words, through different points of view, couched in different linguistic registers and stylistic technical expressions, the very same scene can be represented in radically different ways, as virgin's bashfulness or else as a good romp. Nothing sociologically revelatory, one might say, in this distribution of gender licenses that makes a woman the subaltern who cannot speak, at the very least, of good romps. Except that it is not the sociological categories of men and women that concern Gramsci here, but rather their formal figure, that is, the novelistic point of view. Literature, and the novel form in particular, is not for Gramsci representation of social data, but always representation from a specific point of view. It is, in other words, representation not of an object, the people, but of an attitude towards that object. As Mikhail Bakhtin will write in a path-breaking essay on the theory of the narrative point of view, every language in the novel is a point of view, a socio-ideological conceptual system of real social groups and their embodied representative. Any point of view of the world fundamental to the novel, concludes Bakhtin, is a concrete, socially embodied point of view. Gramsci could not have read the yet unpublished essay by Bakhtin. Yet, despite the absence of much theoretical reflection on the subject, and we can expand on that in case for a question and answer, he was handling a formal problem that only later would become central for any theory of the novel. Different from the transcendental narrative of the epic, sing or muse, the narrative of a novel is always structured from a specific, contingent, and particular viewpoint. As Guido Mazzoni recently reminded us, every point of novelistic view, even that of the most omniscient of narrator, always coexists with other epicenters of sense. Gramsci the formalist, then, except that for Gramsci, as for Bakhtin, sociological categories come back at the moment in which the point of view is always socially embedded. Deploying the optical metaphor of point of view alongside the behavioral one of attitude, the notebooks begin to organize an entire typology of novelistic forms that go from Giovanni Verga's detachment to Manzoni's paternalism or irony. We could then imagine a history of the Italian novel in which formal literary analysis and sociological criticism converge on the study of the technical device of the point of view. I can only give some very shorthand examples. Let me rush then through Foscolo's Jacopo Ortis, just to say that it established the figure of the homodiegetic narrator, Jacopo, as the form to introduce the first-person participation of the Italian bourgeoisie in the epics of national independence. And it also established the figure of the second-degree narrator, Lorenzo, the addressee of Jacopo's letters, as the bourgeois attitude towards the commemoration and canonization of the Risorgimento. Let me spend a few more minutes on Manzoni. As a strategy of containment of popular characters, the formal attitude deployed in Promessi Sposi is nothing else, sociologically speaking, than a political program. Its point of view is heterodiegetic. It does not coincide with the people represented in the story. It is omniscient, like the Providence it knows more than its characters, and it has, to use Greimal's locution, zero focalization. It gives, in other words, both the narrator and its 25 readers full control of its characters' thoughts and actions. The opening of Manzoni's novel, On the Arm of the Lake of Como, intentionally adopts a point of view with no easily detectable individuation, so absolute and panoramic, almost epic and then imperceptible, that it can easily pass unnoticed. As we keep reading, however, we start feeling the presence of someone or something that stands somewhere, an I that takes position in space and sees a headland on its right and the shore on its left. Even narrative time is structured by the point of view, as it becomes perceptible and describable as the motion of the river's water. This I, which often, as in the incipit, stands high in the sky as God's providence, often descends to earth, as in the famous episode of Renzo, commoner among the commoners, at the Hostel of the Full Moon, chapter 14. Renzo has arrived in Milan while a popular insurrection is underway. Now at a local tavern, under the influence of alcohol and peer pressure, Renzo begins uttering what the ironic point of view suggests is just revolutionary nonsense, equality between the classes and bread for all. Manzoni's canon of genius consists in preserving the verisimilitude and liveliness of Renzo's revolutionary tirade, while ensuring at the same time the timely intervention of the narrator's point of view in the story. Ah, said Renzo, when a man says what is right and fair, nothing, this is the narrator, nothing but the very high regard in which we hold the truth could make us continue with this faithful account of an episode so little to the credit of such an important character. We might almost say the leading actor in our story. But the same impartial love of truth also compels us to add that it was the first time anything of the sort had happened to Renzo. In fact, it was largely his inexperience of dissipation which made this first experiment so fatal for him. Compared to the first draft of Renzo and Lucia, in which the narrator barely intervenes to remark that he pains us to say, but it was like this, the heterodiegetic, omniscient, zero focalization point of view of Promessi Sposi, a veritable character in itself, has a much more ambitious role to play. First, to establish the complex attitude of the intellectual classes toward popular requests of bread for all, so as to prevent any fatal outcome. Second, to establish a precise social hierarchy, with the narrator and its 25 readers, as Maria Corti puts it, acting above the popular character's head. While Manzoni's ironic and paternalistic attitude towards his popular characters remained the canonical mode for post-Risorgimento narrative, Gramsci finds examples well into the 20th century, from Riccardo Bacchelli to Alfredo Panzini, it also left some problems unresolved for the next generation. We have seen, in fact, something peculiar happening already in the short passage that we have just perused. At the very moment when Renzo speaks, the active point of view no longer coincides with that of the narrator. Renzo's exclamation, when a man says what is right and fair, is of course Renzo's point of view of on the world. And this is a point of view that legitimates nothing less than popular insurrections. Sure, the narrator promptly corrects such naive popular attitude, but that point of view has been voiced, if momentarily nonetheless. How to deal with this popular voicing? This was precisely the problem that the next generation was called to solve. Again, I'll go very quickly. The Southern question had in the meantime become the political problem of unified Italy, and the Southern bourgeoisie had begun climbing the ladder of political power that would eventually bring Francesco Crispi to the seat of prime minister. In those years, the Southern intellectual was determined to represent the Southern folk, synecdoche for the popular classes, I cafoni, that constituted one half, according to Gioacchino Fortunato, of the two Italies. But such representation had to prevent the possibility of voicing any spirit of popular rebelliousness. Fantasticheria was the manifesto of such a determination. What Gramsci called Verga's cold, scientific, and photographic detachment from the people took here the metaphoric figure of a positivist microscope. We have to make ourselves small, wrote Verga, and look through the microscope at the small causes which make their small hearts beat. There is, of course, the popular folk. The preface to L'amante di Gramigna, the most eloquent theoretical writing by Verga, as Luigi Russo calls it, proposed the same ideal of scientific detachment by making the point of view absolutely invisible to give voice instead to the people themselves. But was this point of view really without passion, as the preface to I Malavoglia insisted? Or was it rather, as Gramsci saw it, but the attitude of the cultured bourgeoisie facing, once again, the people. The question has been a thorny one for literary theory. In 1954, Giacomo Devoto singled out in the use of free indirect speech the key to Verga's originality vis-à-vis Manzoni. While the latter used it very sparingly, characters and narrators speak with their own distinct voices, Verga disappeared instead in his own characters. Manzoni's ironic distance became, wrote De Benedetti, identification between narrator and folk characters. The character speech, their jargon, their linguistic idiosyncrasies, their saying and proverbs, their view of the world, became the jargon, language, and point of view of the narrator itself, who speaks like an unschooled and uneducated southern peasant or sailor. But is it truly identification? Leo Spitzer, for one, disagreed. There was neither impersonality nor identification in Verga's free indirect speech, but, wrote Spitzer, a certain satire, una certa satira. Verga's short story Libertà, arguably the only story by Verga with an explicit historical-political content, is but the confirmation of Spitzer's point. It is, as many of you know, the chronicle of Nino Bixio's bloody repression of a peasant's revolt in the Dukedom of Bronte, a rather large estate that the now deposed Bourbon dynasty had bestowed on Horatio Nelson in gratitude for his defense of the kingdom from revolutionary France. When Garibaldi had landed in Marsala in 1860, he had promised the end of Bourbon rule and libertà, freedom to Sicilian peasants, by which the peasants understood freedom from the Bourbon privatization of public lands for the benefit of the local nobility. They understood, in short, freedom as a redistribution of the lands. As that did not happen, the peasants' enthusiasm for Garibaldi turned quickly into rage. It is in the recounting of this rage that Verga's free indirect speech begins imitating the language and worldview of the peasantry. The peasant's enemy become dog flesh, carne di cane, and each member of the mob behaves like a wolf in the herd. We see surfacing that attitude that Gramsci described at the opening of Notebook 25, when he wrote that for a social elite, insurgencies by subaltern groups always have something barbaric and pathological about them. But it is in the closing of the story that Verga's satirical point of view comes into full visibility. After days of violence, the peasants' revolt is finally contained, law and order reimposed. The point of view focuses now on a miner who had been part of the pathologically murderous insurrection. These are the story's last words. The miner, as they returned to put the handcuffs on him, stuttered, "Where are you taking me? To jail? Why? I did not get an inch of land. They said there was freedom." In the identification or satire, then. No matter which one, the limits of Verga's point of view became clear a decade later. By 1894, the fasci siciliani dei lavoratori had taken up arms, occupied lands, and were channeling their discontent into a coherent political program that had nothing to do with the naivety of the miner in Libertà. Crispi's repression, on the other hand, had been brutal. On January 7, the periodical Don Quixote, directed by none other than Federico de Roberto, published a vitriolic attack on Verga. It began with these words. These days, two of the greatest Sicilian writers published two books. These days, Sicilian ministers were asked by this very journal, "Do you know of the misfortunes that torment your land? Do you remember them every day in Parliament?" From these legitimate questions, another one arises. And you, Sicilian writers of novels, of sketches, why don't you represent those misfortunes in your books? 1894 marks then the death of verismo and of its point of view. Free indirect speech is now unable to contain folk characters' aspirations within the narrator's own sarcastic point of view. In the same year, Federico de Roberto's Vicere becomes the swan song of that very point of view. For de Roberto, it had been a death foretold. Already by 1883, in a series of essays on Flaubert collected in Arabeschi, he had already taken his distance from the point of view of verismo. Impersonality, he wrote, is a mere grammatical figure, that of the first person pronoun omitted from the narrative. If Capuano and Verga had appealed to the authority of Zola, de Roberto invoked instead the name of Maupassant, who had written in the preface of Pierre and Jean that realists should rather call themselves illusionists. Processi Verbali went on denouncing the oxymoron of a narrative predicated on impersonality and free indirect speech. If impersonality, writes de Roberto, has to be a canon of art, it seems to me that it would be incompatible with narrative and description. In expounding events in his own name, in presenting his characters, the writer inevitably betrays his presence. Whether he wants to or not, he ends up judging one and commenting on the other. And the flourishes of style with which he translates the impressions aroused by the material world are his own. What is then the Roberto solution? In the Viceroys of 1894, we have Italy's, I would claim, first modernist novel. Points of view simply multiply. Each character sees reality according to its own understanding, language, genetics, and interest, according to one's personal selfishness. The narrator lets them talk through both direct and indirect speech, indifferently. But differently than in Verga, the narrator can no longer bring to order the discordant and conflictual cacophony of these different points of view. Technically omniscient, the narrator is dispossessed of one of the traditional characteristics of omniscience, the ability to bring chaos into order. As Vittorio Spinazzola summarizes, the voice of the narrator gets confused with that of the narrated characters, and the absoluteness of his point of view becomes relativized. For this reason, therefore, the reading eye can no longer simply rely on the guarantee of objectivity provided to it by a well-identified writing eye, which qualifies itself as the a priori repository of an indisputable criterion of truth. De Roberto's omniscient narrator then represents not so much il popolo, but the degeneration and the transformism of Italy's leading classes, whose attitudes no longer are those of a generation, but attitudes of single individuals, a situation summarized in the slogan of the Consalvos, "Now that Italy is done, we must mind our own business." As points of view become the irreconcilable and irreducible fragmentation of a national community reduced to aggressive and egoistical instincts, de Roberto's Viceroys testifies to the crisis of the liberal parliamentary model that can no longer represent in the state its different parts and parties. It is the triumph of some kind of an absolute identity politics whereby the point of view can no longer represent anything else than itself. With de Roberto, in short, we come to the end of the short-lived period of what we could call the classical Italian novel, understood as an attempt to represent the new people of the new nation. It is a crisis of the novel form because it is a crisis of the Italian society to core. If the Southern question had emerged in Verga's narrative as a strategy for the representation of popular characters, all of Italy is now a Southern question, a progressive disaggregation of the national community that no point of view will be able to overcome. Neither Fontamara's device of the three narrators, nor the ethnographic point of view of Carlo Levi can do that. I conclude then with this sociological consideration, but also with the hope to have suggested that the question touches quite directly the shape and structure of the novel form. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Questions, comments? John?
Oh,
Go ahead, John.
okay.
John gets the first question
Wow.
by tradition. I told him, I would bet Roberto $10.
But now you're fixing the bet.
Well, thank you, Roberto, for that very much. I'm the Manzoni, Verga, Gramsci interest. When I think of Pirandello, and it seems in Gramsci's criticism, seems to me he's interested in Pirandello as a dramatist, but I'm not sure so much as a narrator. I don't recall Gramsci being much interested. And I'm thinking of a novel like I vecchi e giovani, which is an historical novel. Where would that be located in the classical historical novel that you're talking about?
Oh, well, precisely on the side of De Roberto, but probably with very different intentions. I had actually meant to discuss also Pirandello, because Pirandello, before Gramsci, makes a fundamental distinction between Manzoni's irony and he doesn't call Verga sarcasm or detachment, but basically suggesting that whereas in Manzoni you still have a tension between the real and the ideal, what is and what ought to be, in Verga what ought to be is completely discarded, and to use Spitzer's word, with sarcasm. It's something literally impossible. As I said, again, in a shorthand, I would put Pirandello along De Roberto as the beginning of modernism. But there you have another figure, because to irony and sarcasm we would include, of course, Pirandello's word humor, which I vecchi e giovani, as a matter of fact, works in different ways than Libertà. I mean, both of them are reflecting roughly on the Risorgimento and its aftermath. So they're both historical novels. Both Libertà, and I call short stories novels, because otherwise I'm going to ask what is the length that distinguishes a novel from short stories, so give me this freedom. But the attitude, to use Gramsci's words, at the point of view in Pirandello is in a way very similar to the one of De Roberto. It's the ethic and the philosophy of così esse vi pare. You cannot have an ontologically grounded point of view that guarantees any access to the real or to the understanding of the real. But the difference between Pirandello and De Roberto, between Pirandello and Verga, I think is all here. And here you already have, I think, in Nuce, what is the logic of humor. Humor doesn't ironize on the pretension of or the aspiration of the lower classes. And humor does not satirize those either. The famous distinction between the comical and the humor, there is a participation of the writer into the drama of its characters, while at the same time knowing, so the Nietzschean position that still can judge its character, while knowing that the character's aspirations are, castelli di carta, are fantasies. But there is that participation in the drama of the person. One thing that Gramsci says about Pirandello bothered me so much that I had to write something about that, is that Pirandello, says Gramsci, has absolved to a national function. And what was this national function for Gramsci? That of increasing a detachment that was already insisting between the popular classes and the intellectual. For Gramsci, Pirandello basically denounced, Pirandello, who of course had his anarchist and socialist past, denounced through the theory of humorismo the naivety of any position that could embrace the popular aspiration. So while Pirandello dignifies those aspirations with a pathetic participation, still suggests that an intellectual position, a sophisticated philosophical position, a European position, as Gramsci calls it, cannot possibly embrace those aspirations. I made a little bit of a jumble, but I hope it came across what I was trying to say.
Thank you.
So there's so much there, it's so interesting, and you did touch on what I'm going to ask, but I want to maybe hear it in slow motion, as it were, which is about the differences within Verga. So, you have them first, Manzoni versus Verga, but within Verga, there's in the short stories, there is what I think of as a kind of austere form of free indirect discourse, where, yes, indeed, it is the kind of ideological structure of the place he's talking about that frames everything, and there is something that is like the speech of the characters, but it's all in standard Italian, or nearly always, with bits and pieces of words. But it's not very dialect-filled. I mean, it's there is some sort of implicit dramatic irony there, therefore.
Or sarcasm.
Or sarcasm at worst, so dramatic irony. But whereas in I Malavoglia, the narration is completely suffused with this people out of the place. And I wonder, is that an ideological drift within Verga himself, a change in his idea of what relationship the writer or the narrative voice should have to the site he's describing, or is it to do with genre, that what you do in short fiction is different to what you do in a novel, which would make it more like Joyce, really, going from Dubliners to Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake?
I mean, I think your hypothesis makes sense. There is another possible hypothesis that the novel come a little later in his career. It's so in a way, to paraphrase Sciascia and Pirandello, Verga starts becoming Vergiano. So he can increase a little bit those technical devices that were announced, but perhaps not fully exploited in the short stories. On whether just the sheer length, I mean, even that it could justify a higher degree of experimentalism in the novel, because the short stories truly need, I mean, photographic is a good term to define those short stories, in that in the short amount of pages and space, and pages and space for Verga were always money, because he took his job really as a job. There is much, you cannot afford losing the reader in the same way you can do it in a longer novel, when the reader maybe does not understand the sentence. But I would say that even in the short stories, however, there is a certain degree of free indirect speech. Although agreeing with you that in Malavoglia it's much more, and of course in Gesualdo becomes more complicated when he's trying to paint a bourgeois character. For instance, the studies of linguists, especially of De Mauro, on the syntax of the short stories besides the novel. The syntax, the use of verbal tenses, even in the short stories, seems to be mimicking quite a bit the Sicilian dialect. I don't know if I answered that.
Yeah.
Does this translate in terms of comparative literature? I mean, does this argument that you're presenting, is it nationally, is it significant that this is an Italian national popolo problem, or is it something that's more...
No, I do think that it does translate into
you know, mention of Joyce.
Well, yeah, you go from romanticism to naturalism to modernism, and how
very, very quickly, but yes.
This is very accelerated. Yeah.
Before getting to the to Ted's question, just going back to what we were discussing. In a way, that ideal of the novel as a photography, as a photograph, is much more applicable to the short stories, where very often the narrative, I mean, if we want to play the usual distinction between narration and description, you have an abundance of description over narration in the short stories. L'amante Gramigna, for instance, whereas in the novel is constrained by the sheer necessity of having to create a plot, in a way, which I would claim is absent in many of the short stories. There is no plot.
And they're very visual, even in the titles. Right?
I do not believe that this is just a peculiarity. Okay, there are two things. For Gramsci, and I'm with Gramsci on this, the sort of detachment between literature and the people is much more pronounced and problematic than in other literature, for a very simple reason. That the Italian language evolved as a written language, or as Gramsci would put it, there was never a Protestant revolution in Italy. So even the language of something so important in the daily life of the people as the church, even that language was a language completely alien to the people themselves. And literature developed in a way in Italy as literature for the letterati, as literature for the learned classes. I mean, one could start enumerating problem, a slow rate of alfabetizzazione.
Questione della lingua.
So there is a number of causes that make the Italian situation peculiar, but peculiar doesn't mean different, doesn't mean isolated. It means that as I was saying that for the Roberto, the Southern question becomes the Italian question, whereas it's not for Verga, and that's important. I mean, speaking of point of view, the sort of Sicily that Verga sells in Milan and in Florence, the literature really theorized in Fantasticheria, which for me is the great theoretical text that Verga has given us. The kind of literature presupposes a major distance between the reader and the object that is read. Despite the peculiarity or the specificity of the Italian situation, I think that we don't need to follow necessarily Gramsci here, but the theorizations of the point of view in literary narrative, and especially in the structure of the novel form, could yield similar results in the case of British or French or German literature. What I was trying to suggest, I hope that was clear, but in case it was not, let me try to be more explicit now, is that the point of view, after all, is the formal device that, more important than any other one, structures the way in which a novel is built. The way in which the novel is built not only shapes space and time in a certain way. And this is why I chose that little passage from the incipit of Manzoni, in which time is structured as something that someone can see, or a potential viewer can see. But if that is so, looking at the point of view becomes immensely important for the reading of the novel. This is an acquisition that we usually, if we want to put names on it, we usually attribute to Bakhtin. For Bakhtin, the study of the point of view becomes fundamental in the understanding of the novel. But it's also something that we can draw from Lukács's later works, not so much from the theory of the novel, but starting with history and class consciousness to the historical novel. So if the novel is always narrated from a point of view, you need to decide when you tell a story in a novel, or short stories, I'm not making any difference, who is narrating the story. And you have several options that are available. Once you make that decision, then you have two possibilities. One, to say that the decision is purely arbitrary or it's a game. And then we are completely in the terrain of postmodernism. If it's not simply a game, but if, as Bakhtin or Lukács would say, that point of view, so the language that you use, the register that you use, embodies certain social forces, and if you assume that the social forces are not peacefully coexisting together, but they are directly confronting each other, then the point of view becomes what structures, to use Gramsci's words, the feeling that we have for what we see in the novel, and the cognition of what is happening in the novel. In other words, what we have in the point of view is precisely what, for instance, Raymond Williams would call a structure of feelings. And the structure of feelings is not something I'm suggesting that exists as a purely stylistical and technical device, but it's something that belongs to social forces in the field.
Charles.
Maybe two things. One, so you mentioned British and French literature and as being analogous, but it seems to me that American literature is an interesting one too because of the place you started with Gramsci and the Americanismo, and his point about Sinclair Lewis
Babbitt,
and that the Italians can mock the characters in Sinclair Lewis. Carlo Leonati can make fun of the Americans, but they don't see that Sinclair Lewis is the one who's able to present them.
And precisely, they don't see that the point of view is different from that of the reader who's criticizing Babbitt. Absolutely.
And then the other question I wanted to ask was to go back to something from lunch that I believe you were saying you're more on the Gramsci side than on Azor Rosa. It was.
Well, that I hope was clear.
Yeah, it was. But then I wanted to say, looking forward into the 1940s. When on Azor Rosa's part about the in Scrittore Popolo, about the sort of creation of that popolo, it does seem to me that there's some overlap then with in that period.
Yeah, but there is some overlap. But there are some major misreading to be kind of Gramsci. For instance, Gramsci.
No, I think Azor Rosa is wrong on Gramsci. There we agree. But I'm saying what Azor Rosa is saying about those writers in the form.
Sure. And that's a little bit the fate of Gramsci, especially in that sort of post-1940s Marxism, this refusal of Gramsci that ends up repeating some of the positions of Gramsci. You could say the same thing about autonomia, that they seem not to have read Americanismo and Fordismo, for instance. But of course, the reason why I started with Manzoni and Verga was, to take out the major point of Azor Rosa, that Gramsci is a reader of feuilleton, that he wants to reduce literature to il romanzo d'appendice. But of course, that said, but Azor Rosa and Danglani are very important, though, because I hope it came clearly what I was suggesting. In 1947, with the publication of Letteratura Vita Nazionale, there is great enthusiasm for, there is no Marxist aesthetics, there is no Marxist literary theory. So this was a very strong idea that Gramsci could provide one. But both Asso Rosa and Anglani basically killed that possibility. And now it seems to be back a little bit. Look at the work of Marco Gatto especially, but also Romain Dassandre in France, although the work of Romain could end up being dangerous because he looks at the feuilleton especially.
David?
Thank you for that talk. It's really fascinating to hear you talk about Verga's Fantasticheria as like a theoretical text that he left. But I had a question, because that text has always seemed to me to be incredibly condescending, and has always shaded the way I've seen the Malavoglia as popularism, right? And the way it was then fed into the myth that realism has some kind of some kind of benevolence towards the people, and I think that came out really well, I think, the talk. But I was wondering, I don't know how to frame this, how to say this question really, it's just a very vague thought, but I'm wondering, what about the point of view of the reader, and how does it intersect with this aesthetic construction, or sort of ideological construction as well, of the writer who's creating, who's representing a popolo who is not going to read his book, right? And that's always the case, I guess. I mean, I'm understanding the way you're talking about the people as being the subproletariat, the Lazzaroni, or whatever you want to call them, and he calls them I can't remember the term you used in Italian, but I was wondering, so if they're not reading the book, is the novel always going to be distanced from any kind of social impact or any kind of, I don't know, I mean, is it always going to be a kind of top-down ideological reorganization of social structures? Or is there ever going to be, is that the Gramscian problem, is there ever going to be a letteratura nazionale popolare, I guess, or something? Is that, so I guess, where's the point of view of the reader in all this, and how does it determine the success of the novel form as an instrument of social change or engagement?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are many things that you said that are quite interesting to me. First of all, Fantasticheria, yes, it's very condescending vis-a-vis the Ostriche that he's supposed to describe, but it's also very condescending vis-a-vis the reader.
Right.
And even the gendering there may not be completely random and casual, because Verga knew well what their reader wanted, and very cynically was providing the perfect product that worked for the reader. Well, as you said, I mean, that is precisely the problematic of Gramsci. If there are some obstacles for the reader to access the novel, starting with the Questione della Lingua, but of course not only the Questione della Lingua. Gramsci talks about the fact, for instance, that workers do not have time to read literature. It's very practical about this thing. But anyway, if there are all these problems, then how to create a letteratura nazionale popolare? How can this obstacle be overcome? Gramsci is very conscious of a division of labor. Meaning that is very conscious of the fact that the intellectual, the writer, has to belong to a class that is different from that of the objects that is representing. But the solutions that he offers are two, and none of them entirely convincing. One, that the Italian reader is a comparatist. It's not true that Italians do not read novels. They just don't read Manzoni. They just don't read. But they do read Dumas. They do read the French. They do read Chesterton, and they do read Conan Doyle. So one solution is this cosmopolitanism of the Italian reader. And by the way, the discussion on Gramsci and cosmopolitanism now is acquiring a little bit of momentum. Francesca Izzo wrote this very beautiful book. I don't remember exactly the title, but the word cosmopolitan is there. So that would be one of the ways. The other way. Well, actually, he has a model for a literature that overcomes this distinction. But overcoming this distinction doesn't mean that the writer recognizes himself or herself as part of the people. This is actually one of the things that the Gramsci complains about when he's writing, especially about Panzini. Because Panzini, of course, is not the popular characters that he's writing about, but his sympathy amounts simply to the fact, according to Gramsci, and I'm in agreement regarding Panzini, that Panzini makes these characters in order to ennoble them, in order to make them nicer, makes them think, act, move, as if they were middle class characters. The positive model for Gramsci is one, Dostoevsky. So there are two positive models that he singles out in regard to literature. One is De Sanctis for literary theory, and the other one is Dostoevsky for the novel. Dostoevsky is the good model for Gramsci because he's aware of his distance from the people. And his writing, his storytelling, so to speak, becomes an educational, pedagogic moment. So for Gramsci, the division of labor between writer and object, between intellectual and the people, is not something that you can just wish away or deny that it exists, but it's the beginning of a political, if you want to call it even ethical project on the part of the writer, who recognizes his educating mission, his pedagogic mission, and objective of this would be to acquire that. What Gramsci, in some notes, and he uses the same word actually when he's talking about Dostoevsky, but especially when he's talking about the man, what he calls the consentire, feeling with, consentire in this. So Dostoevsky, for him, is the writer who can feel like the people, but that he maintains a distance that is useful in order to move to make the people other than what they are. And in a way, that is the problem that he has with Verga, because if Verga becomes one with the people, he sort of reifies the condition of the people as they are now. And Sciascia, who was of course a very good Gramsciano, you probably know that he wrote this very nice essay about libertà, in which he asks a fundamental question. In Verga's Libertà, you have this omniscient narrator that mimics through free indirect speech but what is missing, and you have these people who commit these acts of brutality, but what is missing is the figure of the lawyer who had organized the protest of the peasant. What is missing, what Verga omits, Sciascia complains, is precisely the figure of the intellectual that was the catalyst in a certain way that could translate, in other very Gramscian terms, that could translate the feeling of subalternity that the people had into a political program. So consentire is the solution, but it's of course a very abstract solution for Gramsci. But again, it's important because this total immedicimation, this total disappearance of the intellectual that becomes this Franciscan part of the people themselves could lead only to two solutions: either Verga's fatalism, spontaneously the people are what they are, there is nothing to transform there, or to Panzini, the casting on the people of ways of thinking, mannerism that are not the people's own.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Jim.
I wonder if we could go back to Mastro Don Gesualdo and the later Verga. So Mastro Don Gesualdo is seen as containing the seed for the later books of short stories like Don Condeloro e Compagnia, e Vagabondaggio. And there's a theatrical element that connects them. There's a whole chapter in Mastro Don Gesualdo where I forget the names of the characters, but they go to the theater.
The puppets.
And there's there's a love story that leads to trouble, and there's a whole story about this love letter that's written, and it's written very poorly. And so the point of view then for the late Verga goes to this theatricality of creating these, and the theme of Vagabondaggio as well. They're traveling players at the lowest level. And there's this kind of traveling aspect in a way that has, you could say, in film, it finds expression in La Strada, or even in Fellini and Latuada's film Luci di Varietà, which is kind of the end of the saga that really goes back to the traveling players of the Commedia dell'arte, which has an aspect of Italian national identity to it, and which you've written about.
Yes, I was going to summarize my argument.
Okay, sorry. So I wonder, is the later Verga, and then the silence of Verga. This is another part of the Verga story.
But I really think there are two reasons for this change of Verga, and I would say more in Don Candeloro than in Mastro Don Gesualdo, although it's true, as you say, that the transformation does begin with Mastro Don Gesualdo. One is the attack that comes from almost within the Movimento Verista itself. Boutet's article is published on a journal that Roberto had directed for many years. Verismo is under attack as basically, what is Boutet's complaint? That it's an unethical way of talking about Sicily at the moment in which Francesco Crispi is sending the military and the Mafia is sending its forces in Sicily to disband the Fasci Siciliani. But the other is, I think, the recognition on Verga's and Capuana's part that the reality of Sicily has changed so much has been changed by the Fasci, that it has become impossible still to sell the product of the fatalist peasant resigned to taste. And as I was saying in the article that you kindly mentioned, it's exactly during the period of the Fasci Siciliani that all these things happen. There is the article on Don Quixote. Capuana for many years is not doing anything, and then he completely changes and publishes I Raccontafiabe, starts writing fairy tales for kids. So forget about the descriptions of Sicily. And Verga becomes metafictional or meta-theatrical with Don Candeloro. There is really an intention to detach themselves from a reality that their way of writing could no longer represent.
I have a couple of So the first one, it's more of a maybe.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah, the first one is maybe more of a suggestion. I was thinking, so there is a difference between point of view and narrator's voice, which makes me think that maybe another way of approaching what you are saying is from the point of view of style. But maybe style reconceived as how linguistic and rhetorical features come together with the question of the ideological posture. And so I was wondering if you have something to say about that. The other thing is the idea of a point of view. Suppose it's the presence of a subject. But what happens when that subject is not there? Because this is somehow related in a way, because you have the omniscient narrator that is not there, e quindi questa assenza del soggetto è proprio importante, and then there is a subject that I wouldn't call populo, maybe populous, because populo, when Quaco speaks of populo, when Foscolo speaks of popolo, they're like borghesi, questi piccoli borghesi, right? So that point of view, the populace, that point of view is not there. And the third thing is, so the initial, what you described as this initial integrity and solidity of the point of view implies that there is a voice that I reader, I can identify and recognize, and it implies as well that there is a reality that the reader can see. But I feel that this model is already in question with Manzoni, because if you think about the column of infamy, what he stages there is what I would call a catastrophe of interpretation. So there is a protracted misreading of everything that the people involved do. And so Manzoni has already very little faith in like the ability of the other to understand, to read, to interpret. And so, sharing the point of view, that's right, that's hard. So this.
So point of view. Point of view is of course a very British expression because it comes from Henry James, and for Henry James the point of view is precisely that of a character that can be reliable or unreliable, etc., etc. And as Cesare Segre, who has written a couple of essays on the question of the point of view in the novel, as Cesare Segre correctly says, point of view is really a misnomer because it gives the impression that there needs to be really an eye that sees. And you see, I was trying to respond to that by putting things on the screen. Chapman here, the point of view is an ideology, the point of view is an interest vantage point. But also I was trying to kind of respond to that or anticipate that when I started with the example of Margherita Sarfatti and Bellonci, because there the point of view is not the point of view of a character with some eyes. It's a point of view that comes through precisely, as you said, style and language. Because the question that Gramsci is posing in the little very cryptic note, I mean, we could spend a few hours reading that very funny note. But what Gramsci is interested there is the stylistic and linguistic expression of that scene, and even the sort of registers that the the writer at that point is using to describe the sexual act. Why does Sarfatti pick up from licentious storytelling, from the Renaissance and Baroque topos of the giostra, and not from the Dante parla aspro come pietre? So the point of view is independent from an eye that sees there. It's a point of view that is couched in language and stylistic and linguistic choices. Language that, of course, we shouldn't forget, for Gramsci, is always an ideology. Language is an integral view of the world, he says. It's a way in which we already see the world as a series of ideologies. So yes, you're absolutely correct. But point of view is, and that's why Gramsci refuses to use the term point of view, but talks about focalization. The problem is, I always feel funny to use this technical jargon when there is a more colloquial expression like point of view. So we agree on that. We may disagree on colonna infame there, because in the colonna infame you of course have the point of view of the judges, mostly the point of view of the prosecution, but don't we have the ideological point of view of the educated Milano enlightened bourgeoisie that once again relates with technically irony to the point of view of the prosecution. I think in Colonna Infame there is very strong the presence of a point of view that we can connect to the circle of Verri and Beccaria, for instance. The point of view of the characters in the Colonna Infame.
Or Manzoni himself.
Yeah. And again, it's not Manzoni himself. That when Gramsci says in that first note that I was saying that the problem is not the attitude, he was talking about attitude. It's not the attitude of Manzoni or Verga, but the problem is the attitude of a whole generation. That whole generation means, in the same way in which we are spoken by our language, just to use some cliches, we are our point of view is vehicled by the ideology of a generation. So again, the Colonna Infame is not just Manzoni; it's that intellectual circle. I would say. But you know that the problem of the Italian novel rises as a problem of points of view before Manzoni, with Cuoco, Platone in Italia. When I don't remember now if it's Plato or Cleobulus start complaining that before we could call this truth and now we only have opinions. And what do the letters do is precisely to create a conflict of opinions and point of view that the overarching narrator tries in a way to contain into what? Because you remember the preface, my reader complains that there is no story. Yeah, there is no story.
Well, thank you for the paper and the discussion, which was worth another 2 or 3 papers.